Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we have got something special in store for you if you are gearing up for the Microsoft Azure Solution Architect exam. In this video I will be covering the topics and questions that will help you pass the AZ-305 certification exam. I have compiled a 46 practice questions to get you prepped and primed for the success on the Azure Solution Architect certification exam. But hold on tight because it's not just about answering questions. We will also be explaining the concepts that will make you feel like Azure superhero. So, if you are ready to ace the Azure Solution Architect exam and elevate your career to new heights, make sure to hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and join our growing community of tech enthusiasts. So, let's gear up and dive into the success. So question number one is that you have an Azure subscription that contains 300 virtual machines that run Windows Server 2019. You need to centrally monitor all warning events in the system logs of the virtual machines. What should you include in the solution? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. So we have these two configuration items: resource to create in Azure and configuration to perform on VMs. And we have multiple options. We have to select one correct option against each of these configuration items. So the correct option for resource to create in Azure is a log analytic workspace, and the configuration to perform on VM is install Azure Monitor Agent. So these two are the correct option, and this is the explanation for both the correct options. You can pause the video and read the explanation if you like. I will just go to the next question. That is question number 2. Question number 2 is that you have the resources shown in the following table. This is the table and these are the two resources. The CDB1 hosts a container that stores continuously updated operational data. You are designing a solution that will use AS1 to analyze the operational data daily. You need to recommend a solution to analyze the data without affecting the performance of operational data store. What should you recommend in the recommendation? What should you include in the recommendation? And the options are A. Azure Cosmo DB change feed, B. Azure Data Factory with Azure Cosmo DB and Azure Synapse Analytics connectors, C. Azure Synapse link for Azure Cosmo DB, and D. Azure Synapse Analytics with Polybase data loading. And the correct option is, let me you people guess the correct option, and this is the Azure Synapse link for Azure Cosmo DB. And the explanation for this option is this. You can pause the video and read the explanation if you want to further understand the concept. I will go to the question number 3. And the question is that to meet the authentication requirement of Fabricom, what should you include in the solution? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. So we have these three options: minimum number of Azure tenants, minimum number of custom domains to add, and minimum number of conditional access policies to create. And we have to select the correct number against each option. So the minimum number of Azure tenants are 1, and the minimum number of custom domains to add. So the correct number for this option is again 1, and the minimum number of conditional access policies to create are 2. So these are the correct number for all these three options. Question number 4 is that you need to ensure that users managing the production environment are registered for Azure MFA, that is multi-factor authentication, and must authenticate by using Azure MFA when they sign in to the Azure portal. The solution must meet authentication and authorization requirements. What should you do to answer? Select the appropriate options in the option area. Again, we have two options and then multiple answers for each option. So to register the user for Azure, the correct option is, and again the other option is to enforce Azure MFA authentication configure. So the first correct option is Azure Identity Protection. So to register the user for Azure, we need Azure Identity Protection, and to ensure Azure MFA authentication, we need to configure grant control in CA policy 1. So these two are the correct options. Let's go to the next question. That is question number 5. And this is the explanation for the correct options. You can pause the video and read the explanation if you want. I will skip reading the explanation and go to the next question. So question number 5 is that you need to recommend a solution to meet the database retention requirements. What should you recommend? And the options are: A. Configure a long-term retention policy for the database. B. Configure Azure Site Recovery. C. Use automatic Azure SQL database backups. And D. Configure geo-replication of the database. And the correct option is already underlined, that is configure a long-term retention policy for the database. And this is the explanation of this correct option. Again, you can read the explanation if you want. Question number 6 is that what should you implement to meet the identity requirements? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. And here again we have two options, service and feature, and against the service we have 4 options, and the correct option for the service is Azure AD Privilege Access Management, that is Privilege Access Management PAM, and for the feature the correct option is Access Review. So these two are the correct option, and again this is the explanation for both the correct boxes or correct option. You can read the explanation by pausing the video if you like. I will skip reading this explanation and go to the question number 7. And the question is that what should you recommend to meet the monitoring requirement for app 2, for application 2? And the options are VM Insights, B. Azure Application Insights, C. Microsoft Sentinel, and D. Container Insights. And the correct option is the Azure Application Insights. So for monitoring requirements of application, we need Azure Application Insight. And again, this is the explanation for the Azure Application Insight. Again, you can read the application if you want to further understand the concept. And this is just a screenshot of the Azure Application Insight. Here we can see that it gives us multiple metrics in the form of different graphs and charts. Question number 8 is that you have an Azure subscription. The subscription has a blob container that contains multiple blobs. 10 users in the finance department of your company plan to access the blobs during the month of April. You need to recommend a solution to enable access to the blobs during the month of April only. Which security solution should you include in the recommendation? And the options are option A, shared access signature, SAS, B. conditional access policies, C. certificates, and D. access keys. And the correct option is shared access signatures, that is SAS. And this is the explanation for the shared access signature, that is this correct option. You can read the explanation if you like. I will go to the next question. Question number 9. You need to recommend a solution to generate a monthly report for all the new Azure Resource Manager resource deployments in your Azure subscription. What should you include in the recommendation? And the options are A. Azure Activity Log, B. Azure Advisor, C. Azure Analysis Services, and D. Azure Monitor Action Groups. And the correct option is Azure Activity Log. So, Azure Activity Log is the correct option. And again, this is the explanation for the correct option. You can pause the video and read the explanation for the previous question. Question number 10 is that you plan to deploy an Azure SQL database that will store personally identifiable information, that is PII. You need to ensure that only privileged users can view the PII. What should you include in the solution? And the options are A. Dynamic data masking, B. Role-based access control or back, C. Data discovery and classification, and D. Transparent data encryption. And the correct option is dynamic data masking. And this is the explanation for the dynamic data masking. Again, you can read the explanation by pausing the video. Question number 11 is that you need to deploy an app that will use an Azure storage account. You need to deploy the storage account. The storage account must meet the following requirements. 1. Store the data for multiple users. 2. Encrypt each user's data by using a separate key. And 3. Encrypt all the data in the storage account by using customer managed keys. So what should you do? What are the options? The options are A. Files in a premium file share storage account. Blobs in a general purpose v2 storage account. Blobs in an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account, and files in a general purpose v2 storage account. And the correct option is blobs in a general purpose v2 storage account. So you can specify a customer provided key on blob storage operations. A client making a read or write request against blob storage can include an encryption key on the request for granular control over how blob data is encrypted and decrypted. Question number 12 is that you have an application that is used by 6,000 users to validate their vacation request. The application manages its own credential store. Users must enter a username and a password to access the application. The application does not support identity providers. You plan to upgrade the application to use single sign-on authentication by using an Azure Active Directory application registration. Which SSO method, that is, which single sign-on method should you use? And the options are A. Header based, B. SAML, C. Password based, and D. OpenID Connect. And the correct option is option C. Password based. So with the password based SSO, users sign in to application with the username and password the first time they access it. After the first sign-on, the Azure AD provides the username and password to the application. Password-based SSOs enable secure application password storage and replay using a web browser extension or mobile app. This option uses the existing sign-in process provided by the application, enables an administrator to manage the passwords, and does not require the user to know the password. The incorrect options. Choosing an SSO method depends on how the application is configured for authentication. Cloud application can use federation-based options such as OpenID Connect, OAuth, and SAML. Let's move forward to the question number 13. You have an Azure Active Directory tenant that syncs with an on-premises Active Directory domain. You have an internal web app named Web App 1 that is hosted on premises. Web App 1 uses integrated Windows authentication. Some users work remotely and do not have VPN access to the on-premises network. You need to provide the remote users with a single sign-on access to the Web App 1. Which two features should you include in the solution? Each correct answer represents part of the solution. And the solution options are A. Azure AD Application Proxy, B. Azure AD Privilege Identity Management, C. Conditional Access Policies, D. Azure Arc, and E. Azure AD Enterprise Applications. And the correct options are Azure AD Application Proxy and Azure AD Enterprise Applications. So these two are the correct option needed to connect your users to your on-premises web application that don't have the VPN access. So this is the explanation of the correct options A and option E, and this also displays the method on how to do it. You can pause the video and read the explanation if you like. I will move forward to the next question, question number 14. Your company deploys several virtual machines on premises and to Azure. ExpressRoute is deployed and configured for on-premises to Azure connectivity. Several virtual machines exhibit network connectivity issues. You need to analyze the network traffic to identify whether packets are being allowed or denied to the virtual machines. Solution. Use Azure Traffic Analytics and Azure Network Watcher to analyze the network traffic. Does this meet the goal? And the options are yes or no, and the correct option is no. So the Azure Traffic Analytics will not tell us that whether the traffic to our virtual machines are allowed or denied. Instead, we need to use the Azure Network Watcher IP Flow Verify. This allows you to detect traffic filtering issued at a VM level. IP Flow Verify checks if a packet is allowed or denied to or from a virtual machine. The information consists of direction, protocol, local IP, remote IP, local port, and remote port. If the packet is denied by a security group, the name of the rule that denied the packet is returned. While any source or destination IP can be chosen, IP Flow Verify helps administrator quickly diagnose connectivity issues from on or to the internet and from or on to the on-premises network. So, if you want to know that whether the security group or security policies are blocking your traffic, you can use the Azure Network Watcher IP Flow Verify. Again, we have the question, same scenario question, that your company deploys several virtual machines on premises and to the Azure. ExpressRoute is deployed and configured for on premises to Azure connectivity. Several virtual machines exhibit network connectivity issues. You need to analyze the network traffic to identify whether packets are being allowed or denied to the network to the virtual machines. And this time the solution is use Azure Advisor to analyze the network traffic. Again, does this meet the goal? And we have again the options of yes or no. Again, this does not meet the goal because as in the previous question, we discussed that the Azure Network Watcher IP flow verify meets the subject's requirement. It can give us the information about whether a specific VM can be accessed from a specific IP address on a specific port, and whether it is blocked by a specific security group. That information is given us by the Azure Network Watcher IP flow verify. So the Azure Advisor does not give us this solution. Question number 16 is that you are designing a large environment that will contain many subscriptions. You plan to use Azure policy as part of a governance solution. To which three scopes can you assign Azure policy definitions? Each correct answer represents a complete solution. Note, each correct solution is worth 1 point. And we have the options. Option A, Azure Active Directory administrative units. B, Azure Active Directory tenants. C, subscriptions. D, compute resources. E, resource groups. And F, management groups. And the correct options are subscriptions and resource groups. So these two are and the third correct option is management groups. These C, E, F are the correct option. So the Azure policy evaluates resources in Azure by comparing the properties of those resources to business rules. Once your business rules have been formed, the policy definition or initiative is assigned to any scope of resources that Azure supports, such as management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, or individual resources. Let's move forward to question number 16. You plan to deploy an application named App1 that will run on 5 Azure virtual machines. Additional virtual machines will be deployed later to run application 1. You need to recommend a solution to meet the following requirements for the virtual machines that will run App1. And the requirements are: ensure that the virtual machines can authenticate to Azure Active Directory to gain access to an Azure Key Vault, Azure Logic Apps instances, and an Azure SQL database. Number 2, avoid assigning new roles and permissions for Azure services when you deploy additional virtual machines. Number 3, avoid storing secrets and certificates on the virtual machines. And number 4, minimize administrative effort for managing identities. Which type of identity should you include in the recommendations? And the options are: A system assigned managed identity. B, a service principal that is configured to use a certificate. C, a service principal that is configured to use a client secret. And D, a user assigned managed identity. And the correct option is a user assigned managed identity. So the option D should be your recommendation to run App1 on Azure VM that has these 4 requirements. So a user assigned managed identity in Azure is an identity you create specifically for authenticating your Azure resources. Here is the gist. You create it. Unlike system assigned identities that are tied to specific service, you create and manage a user assigned identity yourself. The second characteristic of the user assigned managed identity is that it is reusable. This single identity can be assigned to multiple Azure resources like VMs or web apps, such as in our case we have multiple VMs, 5 VMs, and later on we will need to assign the identity to other deployed VMs, and it has a centralized control. Permissions are assigned to the identity itself, so you manage access in one place. This makes them useful for scenarios where you need more control over access or want to share an identity across different resources. So let's move forward to question number 18. You are designing an Azure governance solution. All Azure resources must be easily identifiable based on the following operational information that are environment, owner, department, and cost center. You need to ensure that you can use the operational information when you generate reports for the Azure resources. What should you include in the solution? And the options are A. An Azure data catalog that uses the Azure REST API as a data source. B. An Azure management group that uses parent groups to create a hierarchy. C. An Azure policy that enforces tagging rules. And D. Azure Active Directory, Azure AD administrative units. And the correct option is option C. An Azure policy that enforces tagging rules. And this is the explanation. You apply tags to your Azure resources, resource groups, and subscriptions to logically organize them into a taxonomy. Each tag consists of a name and a value pair. You use Azure policy to enforce tagging rules and conventions. By creating a policy, you avoid the scenarios of resources being deployed to your subscriptions that don't have the expected tags for your organization. Instead of manually applying tags or searching for resources that aren't compliant, you create a policy that automatically applies the needed tags during the deployment. Question number 19 is that your company has divisions shown in the following table. And divisions are East and West. The East one has the Azure subscription sub 1 and West one has the sub 2. And the Azure AD tenants are for East it is contoso.com and for West it is fabricom.com. Sub 1 subscription 1 contains an Azure App Service web app named App1. App1 uses Azure AD for single tenant user authentication. Users from contoso.com can authenticate to App1. You need to recommend a solution to enable users in the fabricom.com tenant to authenticate to App1. What should you recommend? And the options are A. Configure the Azure AD provisioning service. B. Configure assignments for the fabricom.com by using Azure AD Privileged Identity Management. C. Use Azure AD Entitlement Management to govern external users. And D. Configure Azure AD Identity Protection. And the correct option is option C. Use Azure AD Entitlement Management to govern external users. And this is explanation. Entitlement management is an identity governance capability that enables organizations to manage identity and access lifecycle at scale by automating access request workflows, access assignments, reviews, and expiration. Entitlement management allows delegated non-admins to create access packages that external users from other organizations can request access to. One and multi-stage approval workflows can be configured to elevate request and provision users for time-limited access with recurring reviews. Entitlement management enables policy-based provisioning and deprovisioning of external accounts. Question number 20 is again that your company has divisions shown in the following table. Again, we have the same division, subscription and AD tenant. Sub 1 contains an Azure App Service web name App1. App1 uses Azure AD for single tenant user authentication. Users from contoso.com can authenticate to App1. You need to recommend a solution to enable user in the fabricom.com tenant to authenticate to App1. What should you recommend? Again, options are configure Azure AD join, configure Azure AD identity protection, configure a conditional access policy, and the last option is configure supported account types in the application registration and update the sign-in endpoint. And the correct option is configure supported account types in application registration and update the sign-in endpoint. Question number 21 is that you have an Azure subscription that contains 1000 resources. You need to generate compliance reports for the subscription. The solution must ensure that the resources can be grouped by department. What should you use to organize the resources? And the options are A. Application groups and quotas, B. Azure policy and tags, C. Administrative units and Azure Lighthouse, and D. Resource groups and role assignments. And the correct option is Azure policy and tags. So Azure policy and tags offer a strong solution. The Azure policy, you can define policies that enforce tagging standards. This ensures all resources are tagged consistently with a department identifier. For tags, you can create a tag for department and assign a departmental value to each resource. This enables grouping resources by department when generating compliance reports. By leveraging Azure policy to enforce tagging, you can ensure all resources are categorized for department reporting and compliance purposes. Question number 22 is that you have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure Blob storage account named Store1. You have an on-premises file server named Server1 that runs Windows Server 2016. Server1 stores 500 GB of company files. You need to store a copy of the company files from Server1 in Store1. Which two possible Azure services achieve this goal? Each correct answer represents a complete solution. And the options are A. An Azure Logic Apps integration account, B. An Azure import export job, C. Azure Data Factory, D. An Azure analysis services on premises data gateway, and E. An Azure batch account. And the correct possible Azure services are an Azure import export job and Azure Data Factory. So these two are the correct option, and this is the explanation for both the option B and C. For B, you can use the Azure import export service to securely export large amount of data from Azure Blob Storage. The service requires you to ship empty drives to the Azure data center. The service exports data from your storage account to the drives and then ships the drives back. C. Big data requires a service that can orchestrate and operationalize processes to refine these enormous stores of raw data into actionable business insights. Azure Data Factory is a managed cloud service that's built for these complex hybrid extract transform load, that is ETL, and data integration projects. Question number 33 is that you have an Azure subscription. You plan to deploy a monitoring solution that will include the following: Azure Monitor Network Insights, Application Insights, Microsoft Sentinel, and VM Insights. The monitoring solution will be managed by a single team. What is the minimum number of Azure Monitor workspaces required? And the options are 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have to select the correct number of Azure Net Monitor workspaces, and the correct number is 1. So we require a minimum of 1 Azure workspace. And this is the explanation of this correct option, that why we need just minimum of one Azure network workspace. You can pause the video and read the explanation if you want. I will move forward to the question number 24. The question is that you have 12 Azure subscriptions and 3 projects. Each project uses resources across multiple subscriptions. You need to use Microsoft Cost Management to monitor costs on a per project basis. The solution must minimize administrative effort. Which two components should you include in the solution? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. And the options are A. Budgets, B. Resource tags, C. Custom role-based access control or back roles, D. Management groups, and E. Azure boards. And the correct option is option B. Resource tags, and option D. Management group. So these two, resource tags and management groups, are the correct options. Question number 25 is that you need to recommend a data storage strategy for web app 1. What should you include in the recommendation? And the options are A. An Azure virtual machine that runs SQL Server, B. A fixed size DTU Azure SQL database, C. An Azure SQL database elastic pool, and D. A vCore based Azure SQL database. And the correct option is option D. A vCore based Azure SQL database. And this is the explanation. Again, you can pause the video and read the explanation if you want to understand that why this is the correct option. I will move forward to the next question. Question number 26 is that you need to recommend a solution that meets the data requirements for application 1. What should you recommend deploying to each availability zone that contains an instance of application 1? And the options are A. An Azure Cosmos DB that uses multi-region writes, B. An Azure Data Lake Store that uses GeoZone redundant storage, C. An Azure SQL database that uses active geo replication, and D. An Azure storage account that uses GeoZone redundant storage arrays. And the correct option is an Azure Cosmos DB that uses multi-region writes. And again, this is the explanation. You can read the explanation by pausing the video. Question number 27 is that you have an Azure subscription that contains two applications named App1 and App2. App1 is a sales processing application. When a transaction in App1 requires shipping, a message is added to an Azure storage account queue, and then App2 listens to the queue for relevant transactions. In the future, additional application will be added that will process some of the shipping requests based on the specific details of the transactions. You need to recommend a replacement for the storage account queue to ensure that each additional application will be able to read the relevant transaction. What should you recommend? And the options are A. One Azure Data Factory pipeline, B. Multiple storage account queues, C. One Azure Service Bus queue, and D. One Azure Service Bus topic. And the correct option is option D. One Azure Service Bus topic. And this is the explanation of this correct option. So let's get to the next question. Question number 28 is that you are designing an application that will be hosted in Azure. The application will host video files that range from 50 MB to 12 GB. The application will use certificate-based authentication and will be available to users on the internet. You need to recommend a storage option for the video files. The solution must provide the fastest read performance and must minimize storage cost. What should you recommend? And the options are A. Azure Files, B. Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2, C. Azure Blob Storage, and D. Azure SQL Database. And the correct option is Azure Blob Storage. And again, this is the explanation. Question number 29 is that you are planning an Azure IoT, that is Internet of Things hub solution that will include 50,000 IoT devices. Each device will stream data including temperature, device ID, and time data. Approximately 5,000 records will be written every second. The data will be visualized in near real time. You need to recommend a service to store and query the data. Which two services can you recommend? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. And the options are A. Azure Table Storage, B. Azure Event Grid, C. Azure Cosmos DB SQL API, and D. Azure Time Series Insights. And the correct options are the option C. Azure Cosmos DB SQL API, and option D. Azure Time Series Insights. And this is the explanation for both option C and option D. Question number 30 is that you are designing an application that will aggregate content for users. You need to recommend a database solution for the application. The solution must meet the following requirements. The requirements are that it must support SQL commands, it must support multi-master writes, and it must guarantee low latency read operations. What should you include in the recommendation? And the options are A. Azure Cosmos DB SQL API, B. Azure SQL database that uses active geo replication, C. Azure SQL database hyperscale, and D. Azure database for PostgreSQL. And the correct option is the Azure Cosmos DB SQL API, and this is the explanation for the correct option. Let's go to the next question. Question number 31 is that you store web access logs data in Azure Blob Storage. You plan to generate monthly reports from the access logs. You need to recommend an automated process to upload data to Azure SQL database every month. What should you include in the recommendation? And the options are A. Microsoft SQL Server Migration Assistant, that is SSMA, B. Data Migration Assistant, DMA, C. AZ Copy, and D. Azure Data Factory. And the correct option is option D. Azure Data Factory, and this is the explanation of this Azure Data Factory, and these are the steps detailing how to create the data factory. So you can pause the video and read this explanation if you need. I will go forward to the next question. Question number 32 is that you have an application named App1 that uses two on-premises Microsoft SQL Server databases named DB1 and DB2. You plan to migrate DB1 and DB2 to Azure. You need to recommend an Azure solution to host DB1 and DB2. The solution must meet the following requirements. A. Support server-side transaction across DB1 and DB2, and B. Minimize administrative effort to update the solution. What should you recommend? And the options are A. Two Azure SQL databases in an elastic pool, B. Two databases on the same Azure SQL managed instance, C. Two databases on the same SQL Server instance on an Azure virtual machine, and D, two Azure SQL databases on different Azure SQL database servers. And the correct option is option B, two databases on the same Azure SQL managed instance. And this is the explanation for the correct option. Question number 33 is that you need to design a highly available Azure SQL database that meets the following requirements. Failover between replicas of the database must occur without data loss, and the database must remain available in the event of a zone outage, and the costs must be minimized. Which deployment option should you use? And the options are A, Azure SQL Database Hyperscale, B, Azure SQL Database Premium, C, Azure SQL Database Basic, and D, Azure SQL Managed Instance General Purpose. And the correct option is Azure SQL Database Premium. And this is the explanation for the correct option. You can pause the video and read the explanation if you need. I will move forward to the question number 34. You have an app named App1 that uses an on-premises Microsoft SQL Server database named DB1. You plan to migrate DB1 to an Azure SQL managed instance. You need to enable customer managed transparent data encryption TDE for the instance. The solution must maximize encryption strength. Which type of encryption algorithm and key length should you use for the TDE protector? So you are talking about the encryption algorithm and its key length, and the options are A, RSA3072. So that's the first part is the encryption algorithm, and this number is the key length. B, AES, that is advanced encryption standard 256. C, RSA 4096, and D, RSA 2048. So the RSA is basically an asymmetric encryption algorithm, while the AES is basically symmetric encryption algorithm. And the correct option is RSA 3072, and it is because the transparent data encryption protector can only be an asymmetric RSA or RSA HSM key. So the TDE protector requirement is that the algorithm should be asymmetric. The supported key lengths are 2048 and 3072 bytes. So since we want maximum encryption strength, that's why we chose the longer key length of 3072 over 2048, while 4096 is not supported. So option A is the correct answer. Question number 35 is that you have an on-premises storage solution. You need to migrate the solution to Azure. The solution must support Hadoop distributed file system, that is HDFS. What should you use? And the options are A, Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2, B, Azure NetApp Files, C, Azure Data Share, and D, Azure Table Storage. And the correct option is A, Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. Question number 36 is that you are designing an application that will aggregate content for users. You need to recommend a database solution for the application. The solution must meet the following requirements. And the requirements are support SQL commands, support multi-master writes, and guarantee low latency read operations. What should you include in the recommendations? And the options are A, Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL, B, Azure SQL database that uses active geo-replication, C, Azure SQL Database Hyperscale, and D, Azure Cosmos DB for PostgreSQL. And the correct option is Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL. And again, this is the explanation for the correct option. Question number 37 is that you plan to migrate on-premises MySQL databases to Azure database for MySQL flexible server. You need to recommend a solution for the Azure database for MySQL flexible server configuration. The solution must meet the following requirements. A. The database must be accessible if a data center fails, and B. Costs must be minimized. Which compute tier should you recommend? Options are A. Burstable, B. General purpose, and C. Memory optimized. And the correct option is option B. General purpose. So option B is the correct option. Question number 38 is that you are designing an application that will use Azure CosmoDB to collect sales from multiple countries. You need to recommend an API for the app. The solution must meet the following requirements. And these are support SQL queries, support geo-replication, store and access data relationally. What API should you recommend? And the options are A. Apache Cassandra, B. PostgreSQL, C. MongoDB, and D. NoSQL. And the correct option is option B. PostgreSQL. For a managed open source relational database with high performance and geo-replication, Azure CosmoDB for PostgreSQL is the recommended choice. Question number 39. You plan to use an Azure storage account to store data assets. You need to recommend a solution that meets the following requirements. Requirements are supports immutable storage. Second requirement is disables anonymous access to the storage account. And the third requirement is supports access control list based Azure AD permissions. What should you include in the recommendation? The options are A. Azure Files, B. Azure Data Lake Storage, C. Azure NetApp Files, and D. Azure Blob Storage. And the correct option is Azure NetApp Files. And this is the explanation for the Azure NetApp Files. Question number 40 is that you have a SQL server on an Azure virtual machine. The databases are written to nightly as part of a batch process. You need to recommend a disaster recovery solution for the data. The solution must meet the following requirements. The requirements are provide the ability to recover in the event of regional outage, support a recovery time objective that is RTO of 15 minutes, support a recovery point objective RPO of 24 hours, support automated recovery, and minimize costs. What should you include in the recommendation? In the options are A. Azure Virtual Machine Availability Sets, B. Azure Disk Backup, C. An Always On Availability Group, and D. Azure Site Recovery. And the correct option is option D. Azure Site Recovery. And this is the explanation for the correct option as well as for the incorrect answers. We'll go forward to the next question. You can read the explanation by pausing the video. Question number 41 is that after you answer a question in this section, you will not be able to return to it. As a result, these questions will not appear in review screen. So you need to deploy, the question is, you need to deploy resources to host a stateless web app in an Azure subscription. The solution must meet the following requirements. A. Provide access to full .NET framework, provide redundancy if a region fails, and grant administrators access to the operating system to install custom application dependencies. Solution: you deploy two Azure virtual machine to two Azure regions and you create an Azure Traffic Manager profile. Does this meet the goal? And the options are yes or no. And the correct option is yes, this solution meets the goal. And this is the explanation for the given solution. Question number 42 is that you are evaluating whether to use Azure Traffic Manager and Azure Application Gateway to meet the connection requirements for App 1. What is the minimum number of instances required for each service? To answer, select the appropriate option in the answer area. So what are the minimum number of instances for Azure Traffic Manager and for Azure Application Gateway? And the correct number of instances are for Azure Traffic Manager it is 1 and for Azure Application Gateway it is 2. So 1 and 2, these are the minimum number of instances required. Question number 43 is that you are designing a storage solution that will ingest, store and analyze petabytes of structured, semi-structured and unstructured text data. The analyzed data will be uploaded to Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 for long-term retention. You need to recommend a solution, storage and analytics solution that meets the following requirements. And the requirements are: stores the processed data, provides interactive analytics, and supports manual scaling, built-in auto-scaling, and custom auto-scaling. What should you include in the recommendation? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. So, in the answer area, we have two options for storage and incentive analytics. What is the recommended option? And for query language, what is the suitable option? So, for storage and interactive analytics, we need the sorry, let me get back to the question. For storage and interactive analytics, the solution is Azure Data Lake Analytics. And for query language, we need U-SQL. Question number 44 is that you plan to automate the deployment of resources to Azure subscriptions. What is the difference between using Azure Blueprints and Azure Resource Manager templates? And the options are: A. Only blueprints can contain policy definitions. B. Blueprints remain connected to the deployed resources. C. ARM templates remain connected to the deployed resources. And D. Only ARM templates can contain policy definitions. And the correct option is that the blueprints remain connected to the deployed resources. And this is the explanation for this correct option. Again, you can read the explanation by pausing the video. Question number 45 is that you plan to migrate on-premises Microsoft SQL Server database to Azure. You need to determine a deployment solution that meets the following requirements. And the requirements are: supports user-initiated backups, supports multiple automatically replicated instances across Azure regions, and minimizes administrative effort to implement and maintain business continuity. What should you recommend as the solutions? And the options are: A. Azure SQL Managed Instance, B. SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines, and D. An Azure SQL Database Single Database. And the correct option is Azure SQL Managed Instance. So, option A is the correct option, and this is the explanation for the correct as well as the incorrect options. Again, you can read the explanation by pausing the video. Question number 46 is that you are designing a SQL database solution. The solution will include 20 databases that will be 20 GB each and have varying usage patterns. You need to recommend a database platform to host the databases. The solution must meet the following requirements, and the requirements are: the solution must meet a service level agreement, that is SLA of 99.99% uptime. The compute resources allocated to the databases must scale dynamically. The solution must have reserved capacity, and the compute charges must be minimized. What should you include in the recommendation? And the options are: A, an elastic pool that contains 20 Azure SQL databases; B, 20 databases on a Microsoft SQL server that runs on an Azure virtual machine in an availability set; C, 20 databases on a Microsoft SQL server that runs on an Azure virtual machine; and D, 20 instances of Azure SQL database serverless. And the correct option is option A, an elastic pool that contains 20 Azure SQL databases. Again, this is the correct answer and the explanation for the correct option. Again, you can pause the video and read the explanation.